The evening air in Savannah carried the weight of summer's lingering embrace as Jessica's fingers danced across the worn strings of her guitar. The historic square, usually bustling with tourists and locals alike, had begun to quiet down, leaving only the echo of her melodies bouncing off the ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Her music, a haunting blend of folk and blues, spoke of journeys untold and dreams yet to be realized. At 25, Jessica's weathered appearance betrayed the hardships she'd endured since leaving her small hometown. Her father's old teachings about music being the language of the soul remained her only constant companion through nights spent in shelters and days working whatever job she could find. The guitar, purchased with months of saved tips from various diners, had become both her voice and her lifeline. As the street lamps flickered to life, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, a small crowd began to gather. Among them, Sister Mary Elizabeth stood motionless, her traditional habit swaying gently in the evening breeze. The nun had been on her way back from purchasing supplies for the church when Jessica's music stopped her in her tracks. There was something in the way the young woman played, a raw authenticity that spoke of both pain and resilience. Jessica's fingers moved instinctively across the fretboard, playing a melody her father had taught her years ago. The song, Whispers of Dawn, was the last piece they had played together before illness claimed him, leaving behind a teenage daughter and a grief-stricken wife who soon lost herself to despair. The memory caused Jessica's voice to crack slightly as she sang, adding an unexpected vulnerability to the performance that touched everyone present. Sister Mary Elizabeth observed how the crowd responded to Jessica's music. A businessman loosened his tie, tears welling in his eyes. A young mother held her child closer, swaying to the rhythm. An elderly couple clasped hands, sharing knowing looks that spoke of years of shared struggles and triumphs. The music seemed to strip away the carefully constructed facades people wore, revealing the raw humanity underneath. As the final notes faded into the gathering dusk, Jessica opened her eyes to find several crumpled bills in her guitar case. It wasn't much, but it might mean a warm meal tonight instead of another evening hunting for shelter. As the crowd began to disperse, Sister Mary Elizabeth remained, her presence both commanding and gentle. She approached Jessica with careful steps, her eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and something else, recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit. "Your music," Sister Mary began, her voice soft but clear, "it tells a story that words alone cannot express." She paused, studying Jessica's face with careful consideration. "When was the last time you had a proper meal, child?" Jessica's fingers tightened around the neck of her guitar, pride warring with necessity. The sister's kind eyes held no judgment, only genuine concern. Before Jessica could respond, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Sister Mary Elizabeth gestured toward the nearby church, its Gothic spires reaching toward the darkening sky. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere dry," she offered, extending a hand. "The church kitchen always has a pot of soup warming, and I believe we might have some matters to discuss." Jessica hesitated, years of hard lessons making her wary of offered kindness. But as the rain began to fall in earnest and lightning illuminated the sister's unwavering expression, she found herself nodding. Something about this moment felt different, like the turning of a page in a story that had been stuck on the same chapter for far too long. The church kitchen's warmth enveloped Jessica like a forgotten embrace. Steam rose from a bowl of vegetable soup placed before her, its aroma stirring memories of Sunday dinners from what felt like another lifetime. Sister Mary Elizabeth sat across the worn wooden table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching as Jessica tentatively spooned the first mouthful. "Our church may not be wealthy," Sister Mary explained, gesturing to the modest surroundings, "but we have always believed in the power of a warm meal and an open door." The kitchen, though simple, held an undeniable charm with its mismatched chairs and hand-sewn curtains filtering the last rays of sunset. As Jessica ate, Sister Mary shared stories about the church's community outreach programs. However, it was when she mentioned their struggling choir that Jessica's attention notably sharpened. The sister's eyes twinkled with recognition of that interest. "Music has always been the heartbeat of this place," she continued, "though lately, that heart has been beating rather faintly." She paused, considering her next words carefully. We used to have a vibrant music program, but our last music director left 6 months ago. The children especially missed their lessons. Jessica found herself speaking before she could stop herself. My father always said music was more than just notes on a page. He taught me that every song carries a piece of the soul that created it. Her voice grew quiet as she added, he was a music teacher too. Sister Mary's expression softened. Would you like to talk about him? Before Jessica could respond, the kitchen door swung open, and a tall man in his 60s entered, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light. He stopped abruptly upon seeing Jessica, his eyes widening with an emotion she couldn't quite read. Sister Mary stood to make introductions. Jessica, this is Mr. Thomas Henderson, our church administrator. Thomas, this is Jessica. I found her playing in the square today. Thomas's reaction was peculiar, a mixture of surprise and something deeper, more complex. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a slight tremor. I heard the music from my office window. It reminded me of someone I used to know. As Jessica shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, her guitar case knocked against the table leg, causing it to fall open. Sheet music scattered across the floor, and as Thomas helped gather the papers, he froze, staring at one particular page. His hands trembled as he held up a yellowed piece of sheet music. This composition, he whispered, I haven't seen it in years. Where did you get this? Jessica reached for the paper, recognizing it as one of her father's old pieces. It was my father's. He wrote it, though it was never finished. Thomas sank into a nearby chair, his face pale. Your father, what was his name? Robert Mitchell, Jessica replied, watching as the color drained further from Thomas's face. Sister Mary looked between them, sensing the weight of the moment. Thunder continued to roll outside, but inside the kitchen, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that threatened to unearth long-buried secrets and connections that Jessica never knew existed. Thomas clutched the sheet music as if it were a precious relic, his eyes never leaving Jessica's face. Robert Mitchell, he repeated softly, was more than just a music teacher. And this composition, it's part of a much bigger story. A story that perhaps it's finally time to tell. The church's music room felt like a sanctuary within a sanctuary. Dust motes danced in the beam of light streaming through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across the grand piano in the corner. Thomas led Jessica and Sister Mary Elizabeth through the space, his hand still clutching the yellowed sheet music as if it held secrets ready to escape. Your father and I weren't just friends, Thomas began, his voice thick with emotion. We were musical partners, dreamers who believed we could change the world with melody. He ran his fingers across the piano's keys, producing a soft, melancholic chord. This very piano, Robert and I spent countless nights here composing, creating something we thought would be revolutionary. Jessica's heart raced as she absorbed this new information. But he never mentioned you, or this place. Thomas nodded sadly. He wouldn't have. Not after what happened. He carefully unfolded the sheet music Jessica had carried unknowingly for years. This piece you have? It's not just an unfinished composition. It's part of a larger work we called the Symphony of Second Chances. We spent 3 years writing it together, but we never completed it. Sister Mary watched intently as Thomas walked to an old filing cabinet in the corner. With slightly shaking hands, he retrieved a thick folder, its edges worn with age. I've kept everything, he explained, spreading out dozens of pages across the piano. All our notes, all our dreams, and all our failures. Jessica approached the piano, her fingers hovering over the pages. Each sheet was covered in her father's familiar handwriting, intermingled with another's, Thomas's, she presumed. The music was unlike anything she'd seen before, combining classical structures with folk elements and something entirely unique. We were trying to create something that would bridge worlds, Thomas continued. A piece that would bring together classical audiences and folk traditions, that would speak to both the educated elite and the common soul. Your father, he had this gift for finding the heart in every melody. As Jessica began to piece together some of the notation, her fingers found their way to her guitar strings. The moment she started playing, Thomas's eyes widened. That's it, that's exactly how Robert would have played it. The same touch, the same soul. But before Jessica could continue, the door opened, and an elderly woman entered, stopping abruptly at the sight before her. "Thomas?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the musical moment. "What are you doing?" "Margaret," Thomas straightened, his expression changing. "I was just showing Jessica here some old music sheets." "Jessica?" Margaret's eyes narrowed as she studied the young woman. "So it's true. I heard Sister Mary had brought in another stray, but I didn't expect." She paused, her gaze falling on the scattered papers. "Those were supposed to remain locked away." "We agreed, Thomas. After everything that happened." The tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Sister Mary stepped forward, but Margaret held up a hand. "No, sister. You don't know the whole story. None of you do." She turned to Jessica, her expression a mixture of pain and something else, fear, perhaps. "That music destroyed lives once before. Some things are better left in the past." Jessica stood her ground, clutching her guitar closer. "This is my father's music too. I have a right to know what happened." The old woman's face softened almost imperceptibly. "Your father's music?" "Oh, child, it was never just about the music. What happened here 20 years ago, it changed everything. And now you're here, playing those same melodies, stirring up ghosts we've tried so hard to quiet." The church's small library had become an impromptu meeting ground as Thomas, Margaret, and Sister Mary Elizabeth sat with Jessica, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air. Rain continued to drum against the windows, providing a somber backdrop to the revelations about to unfold. "Your father and Thomas weren't just writing music," Margaret began, her earlier hostility giving way to resignation. "They were creating something that could have changed both their lives, and mine." She pulled an old photograph from her handbag, sliding it across the table to Jessica. The image showed 3 younger people standing before a grand concert hall: Thomas, her father, and a stunning young woman with fire in her eyes. "That's me," Margaret said softly, 20 years ago, when I was still a professional singer. We were going to premiere the Symphony of Second Chances at Carnegie Hall." Jessica's fingers traced the faces in the photograph, lingering on her father's bright smile. "What happened?" Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances before he spoke. "The symphony wasn't just music, it was a revolutionary approach to combining classical and folk traditions. We had investors, critics, and major orchestras interested. But more than that, it was about healing." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Your father believed music could bridge any divide, heal any wound. He wrote parts of it while volunteering in hospitals, homeless shelters." "The healing program," Sister Mary interjected, recognition dawning on her face. "That's why this all seems familiar. I read about it in the church archives. You were pioneering music therapy before it was widely accepted." Margaret nodded, her expression softening. "Robert had this gift. He could create melodies that seemed to speak directly to people's souls. We were going to use the symphony's proceeds to fund music therapy programs across the country. But then the betrayal happened," Thomas finished, his voice heavy with old pain. "One of our investors, a powerful man in the music industry, tried to steal the symphony. He wanted to commercialize it, strip away its healing purpose, and turn it into mainstream entertainment. When we refused, he ruined us," Margaret said bitterly. "Used his connections to cancel the premiere, blacklisted us in the industry. Your father fought the hardest, Jessica. He refused to give up his vision of using music to help people. But fighting a powerful man cost him everything: his reputation, his career." Jessica's hands trembled as she processed this information. "Is that why he moved us to that small town? Why he only taught local students?" "He never stopped believing in the power of music to heal," Thomas said gently. "Even after losing everything, he passed that gift on to you. He reached for the folder of sheet music. And now, looking at these pages, hearing you play, you've inherited more than just his talent. You've inherited his vision. Sister Mary, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. Perhaps this is divine providence. Our church's music therapy program has been struggling since we lost our last director. And now, Jessica arrives with her father's gift, playing his music. But before she could continue, a commotion outside the library interrupted them. The door burst open, and a teenage girl rushed in, tears streaming down her face. Sister Mary! Come quick! Jimmy's having another anxiety attack, and none of the usual methods are working. Jessica stood instinctively, reaching for her guitar. Let me help, she said, surprising herself with her certainty. As the others exchanged glances, she added, this is what my father's music was meant for, wasn't it? To heal? The scene in the church's community room was transformative. Jimmy, a 14-year-old boy curled into himself in the corner, slowly began to respond to Jessica's gentle guitar playing. The melody she chose, one of her father's therapeutic pieces, seemed to wrap around him like a protective blanket. As his breathing steadied, the room fell into an odd silence. However, the peaceful moment was shattered by the sharp click of expensive shoes on hardwood. A distinguished-looking man in his 70s appeared in the doorway, his presence causing Thomas to stumble backward and Margaret to gasp audibly. Maxwell Pierce, Thomas whispered, his face ashen. After all these years. The man's steel-gray eyes fixed on Jessica, a strange smile playing at his lips. When I heard Robert Mitchell's daughter was playing her father's music in Savannah, I had to see for myself. He stepped further into the room, his expensive suit at odds with the humble surroundings. I never expected to find both Thomas and Margaret here as well. How convenient. Sister Mary moved protectively toward Jessica, but Maxwell raised his hand. Please, sister, I'm not here to cause trouble. Quite the opposite. He turned to Jessica. My dear, there's something you need to know about your father's music, and about your father himself. Don't you dare, Margaret started, but Maxwell continued smoothly. Your father didn't create that healing music program alone. It was my research, my funding, my vision. He was merely the face of it, a charismatic musician who could sell the dream to investors. Maxwell produced a thick folder from his briefcase. I have all the original documentation here. The therapeutic techniques, the musical patterns, they were developed in my facilities, by my team. Jessica's world tilted on its axis. That's not possible. My father was a wonderful musician and a good man, Maxwell conceded, but he didn't want to acknowledge where the real innovation came from. When I tried to claim my rightful credit, he and these he gestured to Thomas and Margaret, accused me of trying to steal their work. Thomas surged forward. You're still lying, after all these years. But Maxwell merely smiled and opened his folder. These are the original research papers, dated 2 years before Robert claimed to develop the technique. There's more. He pulled out another document. I'm here to make things right. I'm offering to fund the church's music therapy program, completely rebuild it, staff it, equip it. All I ask is that it bears my name and uses my original methods. Sister Mary's eyes widened at the proposal, but Jessica noticed something odd. As Maxwell handled the papers, a small note fell from the folder. When she bent to retrieve it, her heart stopped. The handwriting was her father's, but the content made her blood run cold. Maxwell, the note read, I can't continue this deception. The patients deserve to know the truth about where these methods came from. I'm going to make things right. The note was dated just days before her father fell ill. Jessica's hands trembled as another piece of paper slipped from between the pages, a laboratory report with her father's name on it, dated the same week he became sick. The implications made her stomach lurch. Mr. Pierce, Jessica said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil, there's something else in these papers you might want to see. She locked eyes with Sister Mary, who nodded almost imperceptibly. In that moment, Jessica realized that sometimes the greatest acts of healing required facing the darkest truths. Thunder cracked outside the church windows as Jessica held up the laboratory report, her hands steady despite the storm raging both outside and within her heart. "These aren't just research papers, are they, Mr. Pierce?" "This is a toxicology report with my father's name on it." Maxwell's composed facade cracked slightly. Sister Mary quickly gathered the children, including Jimmy, and ushered them from the room, leaving only the principal players in this decades-old drama. "When my father wrote about making things right," Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger, "he wasn't confessing to stealing your research. He was planning to expose the truth about where it really came from." She turned to Thomas and Margaret. "The musical therapy techniques, they weren't Maxwell's at all, were they?" Margaret stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "They were your mother's." The revelation hit Jessica like a physical blow. "My mother's?" Thomas nodded, moving to stand beside her. "Sarah Mitchell was a brilliant music therapist, working quietly in hospitals while your father performed. She developed these techniques over years of working with patients. But she was shy, content to let her work speak for itself through Robert's performances. And then I offered to fund their research," Maxwell interjected, his carefully maintained control slipping. "I saw the potential, the possibility of revolutionizing music therapy. All I asked was that the methods be credited to my research facility." "But Mom would never agree to that," Jessica whispered, memories of her mother's integrity flooding back. "And Dad protected her work, even after Maxwell's mysterious illness took her away from us," Margaret finished, her voice hard. "Your father discovered evidence linking Maxwell to your mother's condition, but before he could expose it, he suffered the same fate," Thomas said quietly. "And Maxwell swept in, claimed all the research as his own, and buried the truth under mountains of manufactured documentation and legal threats." Maxwell's face had gone pale. "You have no proof of any of this." Jessica reached into her guitar case, pulling out a small, worn journal. "Actually, we do. Dad's private journal. I found it hidden in my guitar's lining years ago, but never understood what it meant until now." She opened it to a marked page. "He documented everything, including records of payments to the lab technician who helped poison my parents." The sound of sirens penetrated the storm's fury. Sister Mary reappeared at the doorway, accompanied by 2 police officers. "I took the liberty of calling them when I saw Mr. Pierce's name on those lab reports," she said calmly. "It seems God's justice sometimes requires human assistance." As Maxwell was led away, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, Jessica turned to her father's old friends. "The symphony, it was never really unfinished, was it?" Thomas smiled through his tears. "No. Your mother completed it before she fell ill. Robert hid the final movement to protect it from Maxwell. And now—" He pulled a sealed envelope from his jacket. "It's time for its debut, with its rightful inheritor." 3 months later, the church was packed for the premiere of the Symphony of Second Chances. Jessica stood before the assembled crowd, her father's guitar in her hands, her mother's completed symphony before her. The piece had evolved into something even more powerful, a testimony to truth, healing, and the enduring power of music to transform lives. As the final notes faded away, Jessica looked out at the faces in the audience, former patients, church members, music lovers, and most importantly, the next generation of young musicians she now taught in the church's renamed Sarah Mitchell Music Therapy Program. Sister Mary's voice carried from the pulpit, "Music doesn't just heal the body and soul, it heals time itself, bridging the past and present, carrying truth forward on wings of melody." Dear viewers, we hope Jessica's journey of discovering her musical legacy and fighting for justice has touched your hearts. Her story reminds us that every melody carries truth, and every truth deserves to be heard. If you've been moved by this tale of healing through music, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that explore the transformative power of art and justice. Don't forget to leave a like and share your own stories of musical healing in the comments below. Remember, as Jessica learned, sometimes the most powerful symphonies are the ones that take generations to complete. Stay tuned for more stories that will stir your soul and open your heart to the healing power of music.